Hello, everyone, and welcome to the One Society Network seminar series. I'll be moderating the seminar today as usual. As those of you who have attended previous presentations know, the goal of the seminar series is really to introduce folks to the broad multi-sectoral impacts of pandemics and pandemic responses. And really, we want to start to think about how these impacts change or could change, policy design and our prep for future pandemics, which is really the overall goal of the One Society Network. And we've heard from a diversity of speakers, from the educational side to economics to environmental impacts. And today we're going to have an exciting talk about interprovincial response. So I do encourage you to go check out previous talks if you haven't had the opportunity to look at those. So for today's presentation, we have a talk on spatial allocation of scarce COVID-19 vaccines. What does an allocation rule based on relative population size, or when does an allocation rule based on relative population size perform well? And just a few housekeeping items, as you'll know if you've attended these previously. So you'll be muted throughout the webinar, but we really encourage everyone to use the chat or the question and answer, question box with any questions they have throughout the talk. And then if at the end of the presentation, we'll be able to answer those questions, we'll make sure to leave time for that. But please use the Q&A function for that and the chat more generally just to share your thoughts. So I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today, Dr. François Castonguay. And Dr. Castonguay is an applied economist with a background in bioeconomic and infectious disease modeling. He holds a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of California, Davis. He joined the Health Economics and Modeling Unit at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in August 2021. So I bet he has been busy. And he has been deployed to the COVID-19 incident management response to help with the modeling needs of the contact tracing and innovation section of the state, territorial, local, and tribal task force. So I'm very excited to hand it over to you, François.
Thank you, Ellen, for those kind words. As Ellen mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you about spatial allocation of scarce COVID-19 vaccines, and in particular, when an allocation rule based on relative population size performs well. As a disclaimer, I wanted to let you all know that this presentation represents work done while I was a graduate student at UC Davis and represents work, in my opinions, while I was a graduate student at UC Davis. The findings and conclusions of this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So that being said, I wanted to really dive into this directly. So the question today is allocating scarce COVID-19 vaccines, right? So while that question has maybe become somewhat moot in developed countries because the campaign has mainly stagnated and is now focusing on booster doses, it's still a major issue, particularly in Southeast Asia and mainly, I should say, in Africa. There's still huge vaccine supply issues in those parts of the world. And these countries have still struggled to give a primary series of vaccines to their population. So in anticipation of this problem, WHO and other partners had created what is called the COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access, or COVAX, to really find a way to distribute vaccines to these countries where you can see, particularly in Africa and in Southeast Asia, where there are still very, very low number of doses that have been administered. So anything that you see in yellow here is less than half a dose on average per person. So, so there are still major vaccine supply issues. A lot of the literature, previous literature, has focused on various subjects such as global allocations. That was more like, okay, should we target countries where vaccines would reduce the years of life lost the most, or where vaccines would reduce poverty the most? What about the countries with highest transmission rates, right? So there's been a bunch of literature on global allocations. Other literature has also focused more on demographics. Should we target those who spread the disease the most, or those who suffer from the disease the most, right? But a missing piece in all of this literature, we argue today, and I will show you today, is how we should divide up these limited quantity of vaccines across jurisdiction within one subnational jurisdiction. So for the Canadian context, how should we divide up vaccines across provinces when those vaccines are administered by, say, the federal Canadian government? So strategies or recommendations that have been put forward by the US National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and by the World Health Organization essentially says that these allocations should be or could be conducted based on the jurisdiction's relative population size. And that, I want to highlight, as it is in bold here, should be done in the interest of speed and workability, meaning that any other type of allocation we might think about is slightly more complicated because we need to readjust somehow and figure out how to do that. So I'm going to tell you more in details exactly what I mean by that. So this brings the following research question, right? What would be the additional benefits of allocating a COVID-19 vaccine based on some optimally derived allocation? Or the converse question to that, which is maybe more of relevance for public health, would be, when do simple rules of thumb, such as the one based on relative population size, perform relatively well, right? If that's what we're going to go for, a relative population size allocation rule, we want to know when is it good relative to the best thing we could have done. So then, well, if we're going to allocate vaccine based on relative population size, is it such a good idea to do so when one jurisdiction has a greater proportion of its population that is at risk of getting infected? Say because there are more essential workers in that jurisdiction. Or what if one jurisdiction has a greater proportion of its population that is at risk because, say, the population is on average older? Should we still allocate based on relative population size in such instances? So, and what about various factors like the size of the vaccine supply, the duration of immunity to the virus, the extent to which population across the various jurisdictions move between each other? Should these factors affect how we allocate vaccines? And in turn, do they affect the relative performance of this rule of thumb, right? This allocation rule based on relative population size. Those are sort of things that we're going to look at today and really dive into to sort of look at that in more details, how those various things may affect the question at hand. So really, the contribution, methodological contribution we do here is that we really developed a method in this paper to assess the performance of an ad hoc rule of thumb, right? So what is typically done in the literature is that they compare two rule of thumbs to each other and are essentially able to say, well, rule of thumb A is preferred to rule of thumb B. But it doesn't really say anything about how good is rule of thumb versus the optimal thing we could have done. So by doing as we do here, that is comparing a rule of thumb to the optimal policy, we're really able to benchmark this rule of thumb And instead of having to focus just on a huge set of different rule of thumbs and saying, okay, that's the best one among the ones we study. But really, we aren't able, with such methodology, we wouldn't be able to sort of figure out how good that rule of thumb actually is relative to the best thing we could have done. So prior literature also does not consider that deviating from this rule of thumb entails potential workability costs. That is essentially a social transaction cost that is incurred from deviating from this rule of thumb. Remember what the US National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine said: in the interest of time, of speed, and workability, we should allocate based on the jurisdiction's relative population size. That means that it is complicated to sort of figure out another way of doing so. And so there are transaction costs, social costs incurred necessarily if you want to deviate from this rule of thumb. So prior literature does not do that. So those are really our main methodological contributions in this paper. So really, the way I see it, the main key takeaway, and this is sort of an overview of the main results of the paper, and importantly, the key implication for public health that we find in this paper is that despite that, yes, there are economic and public health benefits of deviating from this relative population size rule of thumb, there are factors for which we do not have perfect information. These factors may be of behavioral nature, may be of epidemiological nature. Think about, for instance, how much people travel from Quebec to Ontario, or Quebec to New Brunswick, or in the case Alberta to BC or Saskatchewan, right? There's a lot of these behavioral factors that are necessary to sort of derive the optimal allocation, for which we don't have perfect information. There are also a lot of these epidemiological factors that are also necessary to derive the optimal allocation, for which we don't have perfect information. Here I mentioned the duration of immunity, for instance. So this imperfect information in practice diminishes the feasibility and the performance of the optimal allocation, meaning that in the end, maybe the rule of thumb is maybe not as bad as I initially believed when I started on this endeavor. So now I'm just really going to dive into the weeds of the model to really show you in more details how I reached these conclusions. So what we do is a deterministic SCIR model, meaning there's a latent stage after exposure to the virus, but before becoming infectious. We simplified it as much as we could, meaning that we took a 2-jurisdiction model, right? So there are 2 provinces in this country. The jurisdictions differ either by the timing of the outbreak. So the outbreak started at a slightly different point in time, depending on the jurisdiction. They may differ. We also make them differ by the average contact rate. That could represent, for instance, that one jurisdiction has more essential workers than the other. And also a third aspect that we make them differ by is the average case fatality rate. So that could represent, for instance, one jurisdiction has a higher, an older population, than the other, right? So those are just meant to mimic things that we believe are possible in practice, right? That there might be some jurisdictions that have more people that are at risk because of age, for instance. So we want to know, well, how does that affect our results? We assume that there's no compartment uncertainty, meaning there's no uncertainty about the infection status, and that individuals with vaccine failure can be revaccinated. We also assume that vaccine blocks transmission and that there's no distinction between vaccine-induced immunity and naturally acquired immunity. For simplicity, we also assume that there are no births of susceptible individuals. So there are these key varying factors, that's how I call them, that things that we're going to vary in the model to see how they affect our results. One is the duration of immunity to COVID, right? So in one case, we're going to see, right, how permanent immunity, the results with permanent immunity versus temporary immunity. Now, of course, we know immunity is not permanent to COVID, but that sort of gives us a comparison between, okay, what would happen if it's shorter? What would happen if it's longer? Okay, so that enables us to sort of get intuition on how shorter or longer immunity affects our results. Again, for population movement, we sort of assume the two extreme cases. One, when there's no population movement, which in fact was the case for a while, you know, between Quebec and Ontario, for instance. There was literally, it was impossible to travel from one jurisdiction to another. There was no population movement at that time. And then in the other case, we also assume that there is possibility for population movement across jurisdictions. So when there is population movement across jurisdiction, then one individual, say an infected individual in BC, can infect a susceptible individual in Alberta, and vice versa. When there's no population movement, then an infected individual in BC will only be able to infect individuals that are in susceptible individuals that are in BC. So there won't be any what I call cross-contamination. So then the last thing that I vary is vaccine capacity, which is essentially will be based on a certain percentage of the population that you can vaccinate every month. So I consider 5, 10, and 15%. So those are things that I will vary. So this little schematic is just meant to sort of illustrate the dynamics of the SCIR model. So individuals start off as being susceptible. Okay, the black lines are things that do not vary from one case to another. The yellow lines are what I call these key varying factors. And then green line represents vaccines, red line represents mortality. So individuals start off by being susceptible. They can transition into the exposed class by either being contaminated by individuals within their own jurisdictions, or in certain cases across jurisdictions if there are infected individuals in other jurisdictions that may infect them, depending on these key varying factors. Eventually, exposed individuals become infected, at which point they either naturally recover from the disease or die from complications related to the disease. And then once in the recovered compartment, while in the case where immunity is permanent, they just remain there indefinitely. But in the case where immunity is temporary, they eventually will lose that immunity and go back to the susceptible class. So vaccines, what vaccines do is essentially we can skip all of the exposed and infected compartments, and they essentially go to the recovered class immediately. Now note that because of this, I don't consider breakthrough cases, meaning vaccinated people that are catching COVID. So there are some simplifications here, of course. And well, this just represents essentially another jurisdiction, right? In jurisdiction J instead of jurisdiction I, where they may infect susceptible individuals in turn. So really, damage function is meant to represent the simplest possible damage function that we could have thought. It's a linear function. There's one function per jurisdiction, and it depends on the number of infected individuals. So damages incurred by individuals include individuals that are either just affected by the disease and eventually recover, at which point they are only affected by this disability weight that essentially enables us to compare people that have COVID with people that die from COVID. So this is what phi represents here, the case fatality rate. So then this parameter C, which is present in the damage function, is based on the value of statistical life. Treatment cost function, again, very simple. It's just the cost of vaccinating one individual multiplied by the number of individuals vaccinated. So again, we made some simplifications here. We disregarded any possibility, of delaying second doses. Like I know that was a strategy in Canada, for instance. And we also simplified, any potential ideas of like fractional dosing, that is using smaller doses of vaccines that may not boost your immunity as much, but that way you can give it to more people. So we abstract from all those potential complications or that may be related to vaccine dosage. So now, perhaps the most important part of the objective function is this workability cost that I've been talking to you about. So these represent social transaction costs that are incurred for any deviation from the rule of thumb. Okay, so these costs are important because ignoring them makes essentially, we argue, the comparison between the optimal rule and the rule of thumb nonsensical. Because essentially, the whole purpose of the rule of thumb is this simple rule, is to mitigate these workability costs, is to not have to worry about, oh, well, how am I going to redistribute that, right? And essentially, in other words, the key benefit of the rule of thumb is that you avoid these workability costs, right? It's a simple rule and you avoid these costs that way. And in some way, right, by imposing the rule of thumb ex ante, the decision maker is essentially assuming that the cost of deviating from this rule of thumb is infinite. In practice, of course, it's likely not infinite, it's likely finite, but it's very hard to quantify, right? It may depend on logistical factors, right? How do you bring vaccines from one province to the other? Of course, that has huge political implications, right? If you give more vaccines to one province instead the other. And then there are also cultural barriers here that may make that more or less hard to do. So the workability cost is essentially represented by this function here. So recall that UV represents the number of vaccinated individuals in jurisdiction 1 and jurisdiction 2. So in the simple case, we just assume that the two jurisdictions have the same population size. So anytime that you vaccinate the same number of individuals in each jurisdiction, this term is essentially 0, so you don't incur any workability costs. But as soon as you deviate from that, i.e., as soon as you give more vaccines to jurisdiction 1 or to jurisdiction 2, you are essentially incurring this workability cost. Now, this workability cost is dependent on this workability cost parameter CA. One important thing to note is that our approach does not require us to carefully get a parameter estimate for that value, which would be, a monumental task to do in any ways. The reason that we don't need a carefully parameterized value is that we limit our comparison between a single rule of thumb and the optimal rule. So what we can do is just vary the magnitude of that parameter, of that workability cost parameter through sensitivity analyses. And then we can just see, well, how our results are affected. So we consider, a huge range of parameters, anywhere from practically 0 to the value of statistical life. And we can see how our results are affected by that. So everything else being equal, we expect that the presence of this workability cost will essentially push the optimal allocation towards the rule of thumb, right? Because recall that anytime that you're deviating from this rule of thumb, you're going to incur some costs. So, and the more you deviate, the more those costs will be. So to incur less of those costs, you're going to want to deviate less. So that's what essentially these workability costs are going to do. So the objective function that the social planner is trying to minimize is the following. Essentially, by choosing the vaccination level in each jurisdiction, they want to minimize the integral from today, period 0, to some future time of the discounted damages and costs. Well, this minimization will be, of course, subject to the dynamics of the CIR model that I introduced you before, non-negativity constraints, meaning that there cannot be a negative number of susceptible individuals, for instance, and boundary constraints. So the damages we already talked about, that's the damages related to infectious individuals that either recover from the disease or pass away from its complications. And the costs are the vaccination costs and the workability costs. So this is another sort of simplifies schematic representation of the methods to sort of help you guys understand what I'm doing. So suppose this is just a simplification, right? So suppose for instance, that the decision maker can vaccinate a total of 100 people every day. Now, what NASEM and WHO are saying, well, you should give 50 vaccines to jurisdiction 1, the blue jurisdiction, and you should give 50 vaccines to jurisdiction 2. Repeat that every day until day capital T. What the optimal or tailored allocation is saying, well, we could give anywhere from 0 to 100 vaccines to jurisdiction 1, and anywhere from 0 to 100 vaccines to jurisdiction 2, as long as those sum up to 100. Okay, and what the algorithm does is essentially determines the combination that minimizes the total costs. So by comparing these two vaccine allocations, I can simulate out disease dynamics in both cases. And from that, I can calculate total costs and compare total costs across the different vaccination strategies to determine how well the rule of thumb, so this left-hand side one, performed relative to the best thing we could have done, the right-hand side one. So this is really just sort of a simplification of it, but I think it really like breaks down maybe a more complex methodology in a very simple and succinct terms. So now focusing on the algorithm per se, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's very technical, but essentially what I'm doing is pseudo-spectral collocation, and it has advantages compared to other numerical methods, namely incorporating non-negativity constraints and upper bound constraints directly in the problem. That's often the case that it's very difficult to incorporate, so you need careful parameterization of your model to get valid results, but in this case, we don't have to worry about that. And these are very important factors to incorporate when we have problems like this, because essentially it enables the solver to find a solution that may reside on the boundary of the problem. Now, that may seem sort of abstract, but think about in this case, right, we're facing a physical capacity constraint, right? We're facing scarce vaccine supply. So it is very possible that our solution will be on the boundary of the problem, meaning that we are going to want to spend all our vaccine supply and as much as we can, because every little vaccine can have an important impact. So it's often the case in public health problems, and also this has also other applications in ecological economics and natural resource economics, that physical capacity constraints and not cost constraints, as in standard economic models, are the limiting factor. So this method also has the ability to deal with large-scale dynamical system. This one is fairly large, but not I've dealt with larger ones, but 8 state variables essentially and 2 control variables in this problem. So now diving into the more fun part, the results section. So again, I know I've said this already many times, but I want to point this out again and again. The rule of thumb allocates vaccines based on the jurisdiction's relative population size. What the optimal allocation does is it allocates vaccines according to where the greatest value of vaccinating an individual is. Okay, so that's the main difference between the two allocations. The rule of thumb is done in the interest of speed and workability. The optimal allocation implies some social cost from deviating from the ad hoc or the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb performs better when there is high population movement across jurisdiction, when immunity is short, when vaccine supply is high, and when there is homogeneous demographics. And I'm gonna show you in more details that. This is sort of an overview. So importantly, the rule of thumb guarantees by definition an equity of distribution, right? That's what it is. It will distribute vaccines equally to jurisdiction. Now, interestingly, what the optimal allocation does is more closely aligned with an equity of outcomes, meaning that the algorithm implicitly is trying to equalize the infection levels at any point in time, is trying to equalize the infection levels across the jurisdictions. So now diving into these sort of 4 factors that I just mentioned for the relative population size allocation rule. Okay, the effect of population movement. When there is population movement, the relative population size allocation rule performs relatively better. The reason is really that population movement across jurisdictions decreases the structural heterogeneity in the system, essentially meaning that any difference across jurisdiction will, with time, sort of be equalized by the population movement, meaning that in such instance, the benefits of a targeted intervention are really dampened by population movement. So I'm not saying it's a good thing that there is population movement, but what I'm saying is that when there is population movement, the relative population size allocation rule performs slightly better because it decreases the structural heterogeneity. So here is a figure essentially showing on the top panels the proportion of treated individuals, and in the bottom panels, the proportion of infected individuals. So the dashed line represents the rule of thumbs. So notice that the red line is on top of the blue line, which is the reason why you can't really see the blue line. So essentially what the rule of thumb does, as you all know by now, it gives an equal amount of vaccines to each jurisdiction. Now the full lines here are essentially showing the optimal allocation, the optimal thing to do, meaning what you would want to do despite incurring these workability costs, you would still want to deviate from the rule of thumb. So here jurisdictions differ by the timing of the outbreak. The outbreak started earlier in the red jurisdiction. You can see that the infection rate is slightly higher. If you look in this bottom panel, it's slightly higher in the jurisdiction red. So initially you prioritize them, but over the entire time horizon that we're looking at here, you're still prioritizing vaccination in the jurisdiction that has the most susceptible individuals, meaning that the best bang for your buck is where there's more people to protect. Okay, so that's what this figure is telling you. Now, the difference between the left-hand side figure and the right-hand side figure is what I've been calling population movement, or here travel restrictions. So what we see here is that when there is non-compliance to travel restrictions, meaning there is population movement across jurisdiction, we see that there's slightly less benefits to a targeted intervention, as I mentioned, because of the structural heterogeneity that is decreased by travel restrictions. So by the absence of travel restrictions. So what you're seeing is that there is less targeting that is done towards the blue jurisdiction in that case. Immunity length has a very similar impact. In essence, with time, recovered individuals, so either individuals that were vaccinated or individuals that caught COVID, will become susceptible again. Okay, so any structural heterogeneity with time will be gradually decreased because of the because that people are losing their immunity. So again, this will dampen the benefits of a targeted intervention. Again, we can see in this figure on the left-hand side, there is the case where permanent immunity versus the case with 6-month immunity. And we see that everything else equal, the presence of short-term immunity instead of, or I should say, non-permanent immunity essentially decreases the benefits from deviating. Vaccine supply, higher vaccine supply essentially implies relatively less benefits in targeted intervention, which means that the higher vaccine supply is, the more the allocation will converge towards the rule of thumb. So note that on these left-hand side, you have 5% vaccine capacity, meaning that you're able to vaccinate 5% of your population within 1 month. Here it's 10% within 1 month, and here it's 15% within 1 month. At the peak of the vaccination, I know for the US, they were about at 10% per month that they were vaccinating. So what we see is that although in absolute terms, the higher your vaccine capacity is, the more vaccine you're going to give to one jurisdiction. In relative terms, as we can see visually here, the deviation is smaller the more you increase your vaccine capacity. So now, for the interest of time, I'm going to speed up a little bit, but this is also very important, the effect of demographics. Targeted interventions are better or when there are more homogeneous demographics, meaning that they yield less benefits the more jurisdictions are different. So what we can see here is just a base case where demographics are homogeneous. So the only difference here is the outbreak at the time the outbreak started across jurisdiction. Here, everything else is identical, but what we see here is that state 1, which is the blue state, has a higher case fatality ratio, meaning that people may be older on average in the blue state than in the red state. So we see, coming back to the previous figure, that the deviation and the path of the allocation changes drastically because of that, and essentially you want to prioritize vaccines in the jurisdiction that has the highest case fatality ratio. Similarly, in this case, when there is one jurisdiction that has a higher contact rate, you want to prioritize them as long as the number of cases are increasing. So there is a trade-off between the rule of thumb and the optimal allocation. On one hand, the rule of thumb is based on easily observable factors, right? The jurisdiction's population size. On the other hand, the optimal allocation is based on factors for which we don't have perfect information. I mentioned behavioral aspects and epidemiological aspects. So given this uncertainty, is the optimal or tailored allocation still preferred to the rule of thumb? What are the economic and public health consequences of this uncertainty? This is sort of what I'm diving into in these last part of the results, and really maybe the most important aspects or the most important implication for public health. So what you see here is essentially on the x-axis, the percentage change in cumulative cases relative to the optimal allocation, meaning that the 0.00 on each of these figures represents the optimal allocation. On the y-axis is the percentage change in expenditure. Okay, so the pluses represents being wrong about immunity. The star represents being wrong about travel restrictions, or what I've been calling it population movement. The circle means being wrong about both, and the triangle represents the rule of thumb. When I mean being wrong about immunity is that, for instance, I assumed that immunity was permanent in my allocation decision, but in reality, it was temporary. So what is the implication for public health and for expenditures in that case? So the main thing to observe here is that in these left figures, meaning when there's no population movement, really the rule of thumb performs relatively bad. It's sort of an outlier in this figure, right? It's far from the 0.00 point compared to the optimal allocations that are based on incorrect assumptions. Here is somewhat the case too. The ad hoc, the rule of thumb performs worse than all the others. Now, the important thing also to note is that on the right-hand side, when there is population movement, or what I call here non-compliance to travel restrictions, the rule of thumb seems to perform relatively well, and even better than optimal allocations that are based on incorrect assumptions. Right, so to recap all of that, being wrong about immunity has a minimal impact on both economic and epidemiological outcomes. So having a bad guess about immunity length has a lesser impact than assuming certain things about population movement while being wrong about that. So assuming there is population movement when in fact there's none will lead to greater cumulative damage. When assuming the converse, that is that there's no population movement when in fact there is population movement, will lead to greater expenditures. Now the combined effect, that is being wrong about immunity and population, can sometimes offset some of the deviation. Now, as I mentioned, the rule of thumb performs relatively better when there is population movement. So I think that this is important to understand, right? Because now we're 2 years into the pandemic. We sort of know that, okay, immunity is short, that at this point, there are no more travel restrictions. There are no more or very little travel restrictions, very little border crossings that are closed, especially within a subnational, a national jurisdiction like Canada. So now my results are telling us, well, the rule of thumb performs relatively well when immunity is short. Well, by this point, we know immunity is short. With the advent of Omicron and all of its subvariants, it seems that immunity may be even shorter than what we initially thought. People are catching Omicron several times, one variant and another. As I said, there is more and more population movement. Right? Tourism is back. So maybe the relative population size allocation rule is preferable because there is high population movement right now. The supply of vaccine is, of course, from an international perspective, pretty high, but now there is other issues that are that I have sort of abstracted from here that I'm going to discuss in the next slide. And then the other key factor is heterogeneity in demographics, right? And that is a key factor that definitely very relevant to understand how well the rule of thumb performs. So optimal allocations are generally robust to incorrect epidemiological assumptions, but incorrect behavioral assumptions and demographic heterogeneities can lead to considerably poor performance of the optimal allocation. So that's something to keep in mind for decision makers when they're going to think about how to allocate vaccines within their own countries. So we've made numerous simplifications, some, of course, relating to the economic and public health costs, right? We have abstracted from the cost of shutting down the economy. consumption losses, excess mortality, psychological distress, capacity constraints for hospitals. We have greatly simplified also the human behavior aspect. Essentially, the only thing we have is sort of the movement from one jurisdiction to another. Either there is or there isn't. But of course, there might be endogenous behavior change following vaccination, right? Once you get vaccinated, you may undergo riskier behavior because you feel that you're more protected. There are also, as we're all aware, behavioral intervention policies that are being lifted. So that may also affect the dynamics of the system. An important one really is, especially in developing countries, I should say, vaccination distribution capabilities, right? There may be pre-allotment preparedness that is very different from one country to another. Also very relevant to both developed and developing countries is vaccine hesitancy that may affect, how possible it is to allocate vaccines to your jurisdictions. Vaccine dosage, I've already discussed this, and really modeling uncertainty, right? The only uncertainty that I've considered is either that uncertainty that is resolved before, so that's through form of sensitivity analyses, or uncertainty that is never resolved at all. These were the pluses and the stars that I showed you on the figure. So other types of uncertainty may be resolved during the allocation decision, right? So we learn information as the allocation decision is made. That's of course a real possibility that we've abstracted from. So really the main takeaway for public health in my mind is that despite potential economic and public health benefits of deviating from the rule of thumb, the uncertainty around these factors, right, epidemiological factors, behavioral factors that are needed to derive the optimal allocation diminishes the feasibility and potentially the performance of the optimal allocation. So then really the question that I cannot answer, because it's really a remaining question for a decision maker, for the government, is really do the inevitable workability costs associated with the optimal allocation make the simple rule of thumb preferable? And that's really something, that I'm not a judge of that. I'm not the one that can make that decision. It's really more of a societal decision and a social planner decision. And for me, that's really one of the main takeaway of our paper. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here today and for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Francois, for that excellent presentation. Very interesting. And we do have some questions coming in. So one of the first questions from the chat was, did you get any empirical data for the population movement, or was it just assumptions about how people would move through the different jurisdictions?
It was really just assumptions on the essentially from increase in R naught when so increase in the basic reproduction ratio of the disease when jurisdictions were open versus when jurisdictions were closed. And so that's how I modeled it based on the literature I found.
Is there any data out there that you know about population movement between jurisdictions?
I mean, there is, I know in the US, there is some work that's being done, that uses essentially cellular data, mobile data to sort of look at that. I mean, those are very complex sort of analyses that are certainly very informative, but for the purpose of this paper, all we really wanted to highlight was that when populations do not move, there will be less transmission, or when jurisdictions do not interact, there will be less transmissions than when they do interact. So that's really the sole key feature we wanted to highlight here. And I'm not saying it's a perfect parameterization of it at all, but I believe that this, that this really shows what we wanted to show by this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it definitely shows the importance of population movement, especially around that uncertainty that I thought was really interesting at the end there, because that was one of my questions was, what is the impact of making the wrong decision when you are
Exactly.
going through an optimal, if you use more of what you would think was an optimal strategy, but there's so much uncertainty in the elements that you're using to make that decision.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I'm seeing also the Q&A, but yeah, did you have any other questions for me?
Yeah, so I think in the Q&A, there's just some questions for clarification. So one of them was, can you explain more about the parameter CA, how you defined it and estimated it?
Yeah. So let me maybe come back to that slide.
Yeah.
So that's a very good question because, and as I said, right, the big advantage of our approach is that it does not require careful parameterization of this value because it's practically impossible to obtain. That would be a completely different study if you wanted to do that. And really, we don't have the time or resources, or I didn't have the time or resources during my PhD to do that. And the advantage of our approach is that because we limit our comparison of a one-to-one comparison, meaning we limit our comparison from the rule of thumb to the optimal allocation, we know that there is a certain value. We have no idea what it is, but what we do is we just take any value between essentially 0 and a very, very high value. So here, I believe we used some value above, 10 to the 9, so something above value of statistical life. So we just looked at a huge range of values that we believe was reasonable. And from that, we could see by varying the magnitude of that cost through sensitivity analysis, we could see how any type of value could have affected our results. So I have a figure I can show. Pardon the mess. I have a lot of figures. So this is essentially what it is. So anything, okay, look at these top figures here. So on the x-axis is the value, the logarithmic scale of this workability cost parameter. So as this value increases, we see that the variance in blue, the variance of the optimal allocation reduces, meaning that the optimal allocation converges to the simple rule of thumb, the higher this value is. So to give you an idea, this dotted line is the value we chose in our main set of results. So we can see that we're very, very conservative in a way because all of those values before this dotted line would have shown an even greater deviation. And then this black line represents the value of statistical life we used, 10 million. And so, so by looking at this huge range of values, we're really able to sort of forego this monumental task of carefully getting a value for that.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And it kind of brings me back to your question, your kind of final point about decision makers thinking about this workability cost and having to, kind of weigh the two elements. And if you had any thoughts about what types of costs that the decision makers should be considering within that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me just back up a little bit. Again, I believe I discussed it here, right? So what we say is that it depends on logistical factors, right? So it might be, harder to reach certain at-risk population. Just think about faraway regions, for instance. And I mean, Canada is a huge country. It might be difficult to bring relatively more vaccines to parts of the country that are harder to get to because it's costly to reach that part. There's no airport close by. You need to go by boat, whatever. There is, so that's one aspect of it that needs to be considered, definitely. Another important key aspect is political costs, right? You can imagine that a federal government saying, I'm going to give more vaccines to province A than province B, it's going to be very hard to get reelected after that, right? Or it's going to be hard to be popular in that particular province that you gave less vaccines to. So I'm not saying that this is something that they should take into account, but what I'm saying is that this is something that they probably are taking into account, right? Even though maybe they should not, but that's certainly something that they are, right? So there are political costs. Then the last thing I mentioned is really like cultural factors. So I mean, this is really more of a, from an international perspective, maybe some countries have a more egalitarian view than other countries, where maybe some countries are more utilitarian than egalitarian. So that's more of a cultural thing. That's more of a cultural factor that may be taken into account depending on the country. But from my perspective, those are all things that are probably taken into account in such decisions. I'm not saying that they should be taken into account, but yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I think really you're highlighting the kind of the weighting that decision makers are already doing and showing that there is another side. So they are looking at logistics and political and cultural factors, but they're not necessarily always thinking about what they're missing by not having the optimal decisions. So I think it's really interesting and important for decision makers to consider. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So one of the questions, and perhaps we can ask people to email us and we can follow up with any questions we didn't have a chance to get to. We can follow up with you, François, about those. But maybe for the last question, does the optimization algorithm give what you would consider more local or global solutions?
So yeah, so for me, there are more local solutions. There are, I would be hesitant to really extrapolate these results to a more global perspective for various reasons, including, modeling reasons. So, right, just the way that the model was structured with the different jurisdictions, right? The way we sort of talked about cross-contamination is really, you have a susceptible individual in Quebec traveling to Ontario and catching the disease. So there's no like permanent movement of population. So there's no like, really, migration or anything that is taken into account. So, and then also, I think, well, this was not directly incorporated in the model, but the spillovers and the objective function in a way of this sort of social planner that is really considering that as a benevolent social planner that is, allocating vaccines across their jurisdiction. There is, one could argue the WHO equivalent, but there is not really any equivalent from a worldwide perspective on that aspect. So for me, I would be kind of hesitant to extrapolate, and that's why we've been clear that this really relates to some subnational jurisdictions within a country.
Great, thank you. So yes, we're definitely on time now. So if anybody has any further questions, feel free to email us. I think Rosalie put our email address in the chat, so definitely reach out with any further questions you have for François. And I just want to encourage everyone to sign up for our next seminar, which is on June 16th. so about 3 weeks from now, and it will be given by Dr. Laurel Wheeler, who's in the Department of Economics at the University of Alberta. And we're looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you, Francois, again, and thank you everyone for
you.
attending.
Thank you.